I'm going to be recording now, and here we go. All right. Welcome to this amazing class, our last session together. Boo hoo hoo. Looking forward to seeing what folks were able to produce, those who were able to produce something. And what I'm going to ask you to do is send everything to me electronically. Nicole has agreed to try and assemble them into perhaps a single document and then begin the process of attempting to perhaps compose a UU World article about this experience. And there's no need to do that quickly. Take your time. Don't. I know you.
Follow.
When I give you a task, you're like a dog on a bone.
I'm the teacher type, 100%. But I may be following up with people also just to make sure that you're being represented accurately and thematically. And I'm happy to do it collaboratively.
So send it to me and Nicole, or just to me, and I'll make sure it gets to Nicole. And if you didn't send it to Nicole when you send it to me, when I send it to her, I'll CC you all so she has your email contact. So there's no need to print these things UU World 4 times a year these days. So just.
I think we could aim for end of Q1, right? Like April-ish.
Okay, that's great.
Yeah.
So, all right. So before we get there, I didn't assign the rest of the book, for some good reasons and others not so good. Just because I wanted to get through this, but I do want to take this opportunity to just highlight some things in the text that I don't want us to miss. And I believe these are in chapter 13. So I'm just going to walk us through. I'll do a screen share because he does something in chapter 13 and a couple of places in 14 where he begins to finally outline in an almost systematic way what the social gospel is and what the theology underlying it is. He talks a lot about it in the chapters that we really dug deep on. But here, and I'm going to go through this quickly. If you have any observations, feel free to share them. But I don't feel a need to belabor a lot of this stuff. So this is all in this begins in chapter 13. I'm going to share them on the screen so you all can see them. And he's got like 10 points here, and then he has a few more towards the end. And I'm just going to read the main points here. So he's recapping his argument in many ways. So theology has lost its contact with the synoptic thought of Jesus. The synoptic means to see with the same eyes. The first 3 books, the first 3 gospels in the Christian scriptures, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, are what are known the synoptic gospels, which means they're very similar. They tell very similar stories. A little bit different audience for each one, but what he's saying is we've gotten away from the actual message of Jesus's life. That's what that is. Next one, the distinctive ethical principles of Jesus were the direct outgrowth of his conception of the kingdom of God. And I've urged us this whole class to substitute the term beloved community for the kingdom of God. I think it helps us hear it in a deeper and more meaningful way, especially if we're not theists, and especially because the kingdom of God, has a lot of, baggage. I understand that. 3, the church is primarily a fellowship for worship. The kingdom is a fellowship of righteousness. And here he's trying to remind us the different functions. So that the congregation, the reason we gather is to sort of have that worshipful community space where we remind one another about what is of greatest meaning to us and how we bond as a community. Whereas the kingdom or the beloved community, it's a fellowship of righteousness. And most of his work is really focusing on how do we create a fellowship of righteousness. All right? Just making sure no one's trying to get in here. I don't see anybody in there. Okay. All right, there we go. And so 4, when the kingdom ceased to be the dominating religious reality, the church moved up into the position of the supreme good. So what he's doing here, he's recapping his argument when he says that when, for all the reasons that he outlines, primarily when the church and the state are too closely aligned in their power over a society, that the church was encouraged and followed that encouragement to stop demanding greater righteousness. And then, so then the church became more important actually than the beloved community itself. And the church became more interested in its own self-perpetuation than actually demanding that the powers that be bring about righteousness. That's what he's saying with that. Number 5, the kingdom ideal is the test and corrective of the influence of the church. In other words, if the church is not, or if the congregation, to use our language, is not actively trying to create beloved community, then it's not really living up to what it should. That's really what he's saying there. And he explains a little bit this, he's always reminding us of how bad theology is really an issue and something we need to resist, because he says theology bears part of the guilt for the pride, greed, and ambition of the church. And here he's being critical again of the church. The church is more interested in its own self-perpetuation than it is in creating the best world we possibly can together. Number 6, the kingdom ideal contains the revolutionary force of Christianity. In other words, the notion of beloved community, of a social fabric that is equal and fair and just, that is revolutionary, and it can help create the best possible world. And that's what we should be focusing on in congregational life. And reversely, the movements for democracy and social justice were left without a religious backing for the lack of a kingdom idea. In other words, this is something that Dr. King and Josiah Royce and Farmer and Fred Shuttlesworth and many other Christian reformers, primarily African-American reformers, did reinstate within Christianity. Some Catholics were also very instrumental here in the 1930s. They reminded us that the whole notion for democracy and social justice actually can be found in Scripture if we read it accurately. And so, but when they weren't, when the congregations were not focusing on those as primary Christian ideals, then all the social movements trying to bring about democracy and social justice were claimed to be not Christian and not have a religious foundation. This is why today, oh, there's someone trying to get it down. That's why today we have a need to say things like we're members of the religious left, because it's trying to remind people that our vision of a better society is deeply grounded in sacred scripture. All right, that's what that's about.
So may I ask
you
a question? So basically you're saying that people like conservative Christians try to delegitimize leftist Christian groups or Christian groups that were like politically progressive. Is that what you were saying?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying. And that's what Rauschenbusch is saying.
And how did they do that? Because
they will continue to say that the only thing Jesus cares about is your personal relationship to him.
Right. Okay. Yep.
And that's why he speaks about the dangers of an isolating theology that only cares about me picking up my hotline to Jesus.
Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah. That's why he says over and over that the sin that harms the many is the greater sin. You know, yes, it's probably bad for me to drink too much or to curse, or even to steal, as bad as those things are. But the greater sin is the sin that brings more people into misery.
And also the context in which you're committing those personal sins is a context in which social sin has created more sin.
It's very possible that social sin put that choice before you too. That's right.
Yeah.
All of those things are exactly correct. Giancarlo, yes.
It takes the focus off how one's actions affect others, and the more authority you have, the more people you can affect with your actions. So it puts it on squarely the individual, and that's why it gives a pass to the robber barons.
Yes, that's a good way to phrase it, and it makes us think we're being righteous when we're not, or at least thinks we're finished being righteous when we've just begun. Because Rauschenbusch wouldn't say that personal salvation or personal righteousness isn't important, but it's not nearly as important as social salvation and social righteousness. All right, just a couple more of these to get through. I just think this was it just occurred to me today redoing this, that this was a good recap of his work. And so he says, even today, and more so in our day than his day, many Christians cannot see any religious importance in social justice and fraternity because it does not increase the number of conversions nor fill the churches. Thus, the practical conception of salvation, which is the effective theology of the common man and minister, has been cut back and crippled for lack of a kingdom or beloved community ideal. Just a couple more of these. Secular life is belittled as compared with church life. So services rendered to the church get a higher religious rating than services rendered to the community. And this is by religious people, obviously. And so again, this focus on the personal and the isolated individualistic notion of religion lifts the importance of the church much farther beyond than it should be. He would say that the church is vitally important when it has a correct concept of righteousness. But the kind of church that he's criticizing, he's suggesting that they completely missed it. And when you belittle secular life, that means you're forgetting the others around you who are in need and who need to be taken care of.
So you're turning your back on your mission, on what is supposed to be your mission, right?
Yes, exactly. So when the doctrine of the kingdom of God or the beloved community is lacking in theology, the salvation of the individual is seen in its relation to the church and to future life, but not in its relation to the task of saving the social order. So again, personal salvation remains important. Personal righteousness remains important. But the biggest component in that, he would say, and many of us would say, is how does it help us build a better world? And if that's lacking, then we've missed the mark. And finally, theology has been deprived of the inspiration of great ideas contained in the idea of the kingdom and in labor for it. Again, the kingdom of God, our beloved community, it breeds prophets. The church breeds priests and theologians. Now, he's a priest and a theologian, so he has every right to criticize them. And the church runs the tradition and dogma. The beloved community rejoices in forecasts and boundless horizons. He says again and again that this notion of the kingdom or a beloved community is a theory of hope, that there is something we can do to make this world better, diminish the amount of misery that there is, to increase the number of those who are sharing in the bounty of our society. All right, a few other things that he says that I want to lift up here. The beloved community is humanity organized according to the will of God. Now, when he says will of God, he's speaking back to those Hebrew prophets and the sayings of Jesus. If we remember that and get away from trying to imagine what a deity might be thinking, it's easier for us to hear that. And he says down here, I think this is a more important clause, the beloved community at every stage of human development tends towards a social order which will best guarantee to all personalities their freest and highest developments. And the kingdom of God implies a progressive reign of love in human affairs. Okay.
What page is that in the book?
It's location 1433. It's in the 13th chapter, exactly where I may not be able to find.
Okay, I'll find it.
It's number 5. It's the second number 5 in this chapter.
Okay,
all right.
Thank you.
And again, this highest notion of love is just amazing. The highest expression of love is the free surrender of what is truly our own life, property, and rights. So he's talking about sacrificing to make the whole world a better place. And no social group can claim to be clearly within the beloved community, which drains others for its own needs. He really gets down to it I think if you could try, you'd have to set someone up to understand where the book comes from, but you could almost just have them read chapter 13 and they would have an idea of it, so long as you train them to paraphrase or translate kingdom of God to beloved community. And yeah, the reign of love, here's at the bottom, this is a beautiful one too. The reign of love tends toward the progressive unity of humankind but with the maintenance of individual liberty and opportunity of nations to work out their own national ideals. And since the beloved community is the supreme end of the Almighty, it must be the purpose for which the church exists. So it's fascinating to me, because what he wants to say over and over, that churches that are not organized, focused on dismantling oppression and liberating people from all of the social systems and all of the obstacles that keep them from reaching their potential, they are missing the mark. And he says something at the end, which not all of the church folk, I'm sure, who read this at first enjoyed, but the beloved community is not confined within the limits of the church and its activities. All right, so there you go. In many ways, that chapter 13 can condense the overall understanding of this text in a way. I think it helps to have read the other 12 chapters first, because we've had a chance to encounter his arguments as they've flown, as they've gone through different manifestations and such. But the most important thing to me is how much we can do all of this. So I do understand that some folks may not have something to read today, and that's okay, because we're going to want you to hear what other people have read. Cher Pullen says she's more than happy to work with you in putting together the text. So thank you, Cher, and I'll make sure you have a way to get in touch with her. So we're not going to shame anyone because they don't have other homework tonight. This was not an easy assignment. It's one the likes of which many of you may have never done before. But I still encourage you to add your voice to this, over the coming days and weeks, because I think it'll be good for you, and it'll certainly enrich the offering that we have as an output of this class. And I will challenge you all to make sure that I don't lose sight of the notion that maybe we need to actually do a service about this. So,
We do, I think.
Well, there you heard it first. So okay, so
Yes.
the gauntlet has been thrown at my feet. Oh, sorry, that's good though. I appreciate that. I appreciate the willingness and desire to do that. So, all right. So I'm going to take a step back. So folks, any observations, questions, concerns before I start moving us through some of our writing pieces here? I'll put it up in the gallery view. Did I see your hand, Deborah? Okay. All right. Good. All righty. Awesome. Here we go.
A sermon title.
Oh, yes. Yeah.
Nice. Did you see Zep's topic?
Oh, yeah.
Mhm. I love that.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. Or we can do two services, one on sin and one on salvation.
And we can have like a time for all ages where sin and salvation like come together
And have a battle.
Yeah. Or they do a poetic harmonic dance and sin just goes away.
We're transformed.
Exactly.
I
We
feel
can have
like
so
this
much
is worse
fun.
than my dress.
That's exactly what I'm looking at. Have you noticed? Have you seen me work on something? I'm not afraid to stir it up. Anyway, so all right. So seeing no one with any real observations and such, I really do hope folks are not afraid to share this text and your writing from this class and your ideas from this class with others. We're not going to have another one of these deep dive classes until February, when Johanna Foster and they might be looking for another co-facilitator. I don't know. I think Johanna and I can do it, but we're going to be teaching Tikva Frymer-Kinski's The Women of the Bible. And it's a great text, well written, well researched. She reaches back to pre-Judaic myths and stories to try and look at some of the potential antecedents of some of the biblical women. And we know some of them, but it's nice, instead of just studying them Oh yeah, there's some women in the Bible too who aren't just used for,
Right.
this, that to make them the center of our inquiry. So that's what we're going to do. And Johanna Foster is not a biblical scholar, but she is a teacher. So that's why she's helping me with this. And last time I checked, she identifies as a woman. So both of those things make her a really good co-facilitator.
For sure.
So looking forward to that in January.
Took a whole class on that.
What's that?
I took a whole class on that.
Oh, well, maybe you can be one of our co-facilitators. Maybe we'll invite you into helping us making sure we're rounding out some of the non-Judaic antecedents of the mythology. That might.
That would work. I posted my preamble in
You
chat.
did post it. Do you want to read it to all of us?
Not really. I want to watch people's reactions.
Oh, okay. So I'll read it.
Because we can't see it. We can't see it.
She's gonna read this one. It's easier. It's too dark. It's too small.
Oh yeah, you're gonna send it to me and then I can share screen.
Oh, this is my. Send it to myself already.
Okay. Oh, okay. All right. So Foxy's Theology for the Social Gospel. Having been raised in a very active Protestant family, and as one who went to sleep at church more often than in my own bed at night, which is just a great line, and I want to know more about that. I have a thorough understanding of the words sin and salvation in their common Christian usage. However, neither pertains in my personal practice, and my relationship with deity is not one of subservience. So worship is also a null term. A word under sin, a word understood from childhood as doing wrong or hurting others deliberately or not, but since leaving Abrahamic religions, abandoned. My faith requires personal responsibility, nor is it my place to assign terms such as sin to others because they're responsible for their own behavior. Although I do bear some responsibility for those who study under me, there is a limited and contracted response. That is a limited and contracted responsibility. Were others to violate that contract, some might consider it simple. However, I view it as a breach of trust, no more, no less. That is what dictates my response. Since honor, in the sense of morality and ethics, is co-equal with personal responsibility, violating those is as close to a definition of sin as I can come and stay within the boundaries of my own spiritual practice. So I'm just going to ask you a question about that, Cher, before I move on to salvation. Since honor is co-equal with personal responsibility, so it sounds like you want to redefine sin as a violation of honor and personal responsibility. Am I understanding you correctly? I don't hear you, Cher. Sorry.
For my personal practice, absolutely. I know that others don't hold the same things to the same degree of importance as I do, but honor and responsibility are, to me, two sides of the same coin, and that's our gold standard.
And so honor and personal responsibility don't just deal with the individual, but they do deal with how we interact with others. Okay, that's
absolutely.
Good. So I'm going to go to your attempt at salvation. Thank you. All right, yet another non-salvation, yet another non-word. It's not a non-word. It's just one that you don't embrace in current spiritual vocabulary. Okay, I'm just messing with you, Sharon. You know that. My understanding of it was predicated on a greater absence than prevalence of sin. Predicated on a greater absence than a prevalence of sin. Okay, of more good works than ill doing accumulated over a lifetime. So you're presenting it as a kind of calculus. I got it. Because my spiritual practice requires responsibility for my actions, the concept of personal salvation drastically morphs since I reject the concept of one lifetime in which to perfect one's behaviors. Salvation does not apply as a reward for a life's work. When you believe, as I do, that a life is more closely related to a grade of schooling, set issues with which one must deal, such as mistakes one must overcome or correct, certain levels of personal growth toward which one must at least attempt, if not completely succeed. The end of a lifetime requires a view of those lessons, determining where one made gains and what one failed to achieve. and with the expectation that a succeeding life will bring about the opportunities for further improvement and growth. Given enough time, one does not ascend to any heaven where one is expected to sit on a cloud singing hosannas ad nauseum, but become enlightened, whereupon one becomes a guide to help others along their journey, or opts to return to a physical body to do so as a human or other sentient race. I'll stop there because you've been remarkably thorough, and I want to give people a chance to respond before I read your next two. Any observations or questions for Sharon?
The singing out hosannas ad nauseum came as a direct result of my extremely religious mother and I's conversations just weeks before her unexpected passing. And she decided she did not want to, and I quote, sit in heaven, sit on a cloud, play a harp, and sing hosannas ad nauseum. She'd rather go to the Summerlands.
Awesome. Any questions for Cher or observations in what she shared? I know it's tough to just hear it. You know, she did put it in the chat if you want to read it in the chat. And you should know that it's difficult, Cher, to put all of it in the chat, right?
Yeah, I put the amended preamble. I worked on this a little bit just before class. So the preamble's a little longer because I left out the theology aspect.
Okay, well, don't do that. All right. Well, so I'm not seeing anyone raise their hand. I will now read your response to social sin. Yes, it exists still, much as Rauschenbusch outlined, while the extreme deprivation perpetuated by coal barons, sweatshops, prisons, and Indian schools is mostly gone because they became illegal. The complete disregard of owners or corporate CEOs have for their employees and their families has barely changed. All too often, the deity behind the situation remains the almighty dollar, where profit trumps all else. Interesting choice of verb there, Cher. However,
deliberate.
I'm sure it was. I know you well enough. However, responsibility is not solely to one's deity or self, but mitikayu oasian. Yes, all my relations. That's a Native American term, if I recall.
It's Lakota.
Yep, Dakota. Yep. Thus, I am responsible to and for my black, brown, yellow, and red brother and sisters, the finned, furred, and feathered, and scaled siblings, stone and air beings, and Gaia herself. Social salvation. Because I live in this world and my being impacts everyone and everything else to some degree, I have a responsibility to all my relations, the greater world. Some aspects of that responsibility I've worked on for more than 60 years. Ecology, for instance. We fed birds every winter in part for the entertainment and educational value of watching them, perhaps more than because they required our help. But I'm sure more survived because of it, given upstate New York winters. Our family routinely gave of our time, our produce, and even shared our home with immigrants, visiting foreign clergy, and the less fortunate, including my adopted siblings. I have advocated for appropriate native rights since I was 10. I've acted for the betterment of the environment since the 1960s. I also advocate for LGBTQ+ and pagan rights for decades, since those rights deeply impact my son, niece, and household. If I want my descendants to have a saner, healthier world than the one I inherited, social salvation is a must. Quite well done.
Thank you.
Everyone give their praise to Cher. Fascinating and astounding, I might say. There we go. So I don't think we're going to have a lack of stuff to work with here, Nicole and Cher, for putting this together. Any responses or questions for Cher? Sure, go ahead, Giancarlo.
So in terms of sin against salvation, am I hearing you right in that you're defining it as a not a tally, but as have I done more good than bad, or do you feel that's how it's been defined in that context?
That's the way it was taught to me as a child. You reach salvation not only by baptism. With baptism has always been a contested point, because those of us that were baptized as infants, according to some Christian churches, weren't really baptized. So the baptism part kind of went by the wayside. But using the Egyptian model, your soul, in Egyptian pantheon, or in the Egyptian belief system, your soul was measured against a feather of Maat, and Maat was the goddess of justice. And if your soul was lighter because you had done enough good works than her feather, then you went on to the afterlife. If your soul was heavier because you had, quote unquote, sinned more, then you went to the crocodile god, and you did not go to the afterlife. So you were never also reborn. That was nearer what I was taught, as explained through a different lens.
Wow. Interesting. Thank you for that. I love some of the Egyptian theology. Thanks for sharing that. Kemetic peoples. All right. Let's take a deep breath and give thanks for what was shared. And I know Mary brought something. I'm going to invite Mary to go next.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I hope you're ready for this. It's nothing is going to start.
Hold on, Mary. Mary did warn us earlier that she may not have followed the assignment. So I think it was fair to tell the rest of the folks there in case they're wondering.
Yeah.
I don't know that for sure, but that's just what she said to us when she came onto the call. So go ahead, Mary.
Okay. Started off with sort of my belief. Joseph Campbell presents the concept that God is a three-letter word used to symbolize the unknown. And over time, that word morphed from being the symbolic to becoming a fact. Now, I agree with him, and I use the word God as a symbol to represent the unknown. I also agree with Rabbi David Cooper, who refers to the word God as being a verb. I also believe that what is commonly accepted, which is that it was from this unknown that the world was created. And I believe that the world was created and manifested itself as a world of opposites, spiritual and material. On the material plane, another dualism manifests in nature. First, there's a prime directive, an instinct for self-preservation. That is the desire to procreate, obtain shelter, protect territory, obtain food, which is often accompanied by extreme violence. The second manifestation is the instinct to merge together. This desire is so pervasive, it's even found on the cellular level and called collective cellular motion. So on the material plane, self-interest or individualism and socialism appear to have been at odds with each other right from the beginning of time. In order for many people, each whom possess the same desire of self-interest, albeit differing strengths, in order for them to live together in a group harmoniously, two things had to have happened. First, they had to feel the group living was beneficial to their self-interest. Secondly, in order to maintain the group, self-interest needed to be tamped down or limited. Different approaches were taken in the form of agreed upon doctrines, rules, and laws to achieve this. According to Wikipedia, one of the earliest historical examples of government reform trying to achieve higher level of freedom and equality and curb excess of the elite was the Code of Urukagina from the 24th century BC. In order that widows and orphans, and I love this phrase is still used today, in order that widows and orphans were not at the mercy of powerful men, he exempted them from taxes and had the city pay for the funeral. He also decreed that the rich must use silver when purchasing from the poor. And if the poor did not wish to sell, the powerful man could not force him to do so. He took measures against usury, burdensome controls, hunger, theft, murder, and seizure of people's property or persons. His code was the first time in recorded history that the word freedom appears. These actions were considered crimes, and punishments for their violations ranged from monetary fines to death. The balancing of opposites was also addressed by religions. But here we find the concepts of the spiritual and material opposites married to the self-interest and the socialistic opposites. And the objective of this marriage is salvation. In many Eastern traditions, in order to attain reunion with the creative spiritual unknown, you must transcend the material world. This means you must try to rise above all your desires, that is, keep them at a minimum, and understand that while the journey is yours alone, we each have a spark of the unknown within us, and each must be treated as part of the one. In Western traditions, however, in order to attain reunion with the spiritual, which they call salvation, you must subjugate the material. Unlike their Eastern counterpart, they often view natural inclinations as sinful or evil. Salvation is attained collectively through the believers within each church, but doesn't apply to those outside of it. We've already touched upon some of the variations these different religious systems have provided. Many pagans saw both divinity and salvation in nature, and sin in the violation or abuse of these material things. While the Gnostics believed that material things were sinful, and to avoid them as much as possible, because they were created by the lesser of the two gods, the god of evil, and salvation came from personal knowledge with the hidden god of good, the unknown. Epictetus echoed this doctrine when he said, "You are a soul carrying a corpse." In our readings, W.R. felt salvation came from fulfilling social obligations towards others. All in all, whether it's the desire for, the repudiation of, the abuse or worship of, it is the opposites in our material world that appear to be the core focus of the laws and doctrines we have reviewed and created, either to obtain personal salvation or harmony and equity within society. But what if we perceive the opposites as complementing each other rather than being in contention with each other? We then compose a philosophy that is all-encompassing. A philosophy which embraces both Eastern and Western traditions and works through each individual for the common good. This type of philosophy is found in many of the mystical, and esoteric religions and organizations, some of which adapted the Kabbalistic pattern called the Tree of Life to function as a roadmap or instruction manual for their own school of thought, which taught how to live your life and transcend the material plane, reuniting your spiritual spark with the unknown, like an electron returning to its source. C.S. Lewis embraced this concept when he said, "You have no soul. You are a soul. You have a body." According to reformjudaism.org, Kabbalistic practitioners tend to view the creator and the creation as a continuum rather than as discrete entities. Kabbalist Moses Cordovero wrote, "The essence of divinity is found in every single thing. Nothing but it exists. It exists in every existent." The practical dimension of Kabbalah involves rituals for gaining and exercising power to effect change in our world and in the celestial worlds beyond. The practical aspect of Kabbalah furthers God's loving intention in the world, advancing good, subduing evil, and fulfills the human potential to be co-creator with God. But as William G. Gray reminds us in his series of books, all energy, including divine energy, is polarized. He reminds us that we should never forget the terms good and evil are purely our human interpretations of the effects of that energy in relationship to our lives. One man's good is another man's evil, just like there are two sides to the same coin. He instructs one of the first laws learned in the study of electromagnetism is that poles repel, like poles repel, and unlike poles attract. Therefore, there could be an adequate case made for the theory that prolonged concentration on either polarity would automatically attract its opposite. What it means is that we should make deliberate choice between two known courses by consciously contrasting them and ultimately find a middle way of balance and put that as the chosen practice. He warns us about overreach. We have countless examples where we have seen evil rise from good. Hospitals originally erected with good intentions to house the mentally ill become places of lobotomies and forced sterilizations, also performed for the. Or a church established to save souls from evil, having such strict and unbending rules, the penitent becomes vengeful and angry and hateful. But good also arises from evil, with the UN, for example, like the UN as an organization dedicated to peace emerging from the ashes of a war, or the medical milestones achieved with plastic surgery and prosthetics while trying to mend torn bodies. In his books, William Gray gives us practical exercises to pursue a path of self-consciousness and awareness, to look at ourselves carefully, thoroughly, intimately. Similar to the Jewish tradition of counting the Omer, he uses the emanations on the Tree of Life map to guide us through examination and helps us to check our spiritual growth and helps to find how we interact with the world around us. For example, he asks, do you know the importance of being self, or do you want to be known by your self-importance? Do you control confusion in yourself and others, or do you confuse others, then control them yourself? Do you admire the possibilities of learning, or have you learned how it's possible to be admired? Our aim is to have all our thoughts, words, and deeds as closely to the center of the opposing forces as possible, where they cancel each other out.
Hey, Mary, let me stop you for a second. I just want to ask you how much more you have, because you've
Not
given
much.
us a whole lot to
Not
think
much.
about.
Not
All
much.
right.
Let me finish.
And I'm waiting to get to what Mary thinks. You've offered us a very nice historical and anthropological and philosophical conversation, but I'm hoping to hear what Mary thinks. So continue.
Okay. Our aim is to have all our thoughts, words, and deeds as close to the center of the opposing polarities as possible, where they cancel each other out and leave us at the center of the fulcrum, the zero on the number line, the nil, which is the perfect balance and the perfect center of divinity. In my doctrine, or in this doctrine, we are both material and spirit. In this doctrine, we exist between the emanations of two compelling divine energies or polarities. In this doctrine, there is no good or evil, only our interpretation of the effects of that energy has on our lives. There is no sin, only imbalance of divine energy. Salvation is reunion with the unknown that we emanated from. And all one day will attain salvation regardless of the number of births needed. When each individual applies balancing their own spiritual polarities every day in their living and decision-making, the society they live in will be strongly impacted by the better. That's it.
Dr. Mary E. Jones.
Really good.
I'd like to call you an overachiever, but you may not like that about me. Yes, so thank you for that. And really, and what your thought came in at the end there, sort of a couple of sentences before you started talking about the fulcrum. And so make sure you send that to me and Nicole. But you provided a lot of stuff for thought. And there's probably too much that you offered for us to try and unpack it all. And,
I have a question.
other thing I shared, and I'll get to Nicole's question is, you presented some strong statements about polarization, but, I put in the chat that I do see polarization as a theological claim, and you're making that claim. So that's important that you made it in as part of a larger conversation. So, I think that's very important that you made that claim. Nicole, question.
Mary, first of all, it was really incredible. I really enjoyed that. I missed a couple of your points and I know that I'm going to see the entire thing, but there were a couple of things that I really wanted to have written down. The 24th century BC, who was
That's the leader.
Yeah,
with the law code.
who was that person?
Epictetus.
Can you please spell that?
Just put it in the chat.
Yeah, in the chat.
I
And so
can't. It got you on a small screen over here. When I go back, I'm in a post session. So,
Yeah.
Go
Go ahead and spell it out loud for us then.
I think it's EPIC, Epic, TETUS.
Oh, Epictetus.
Oh, Epictetus. Yeah. So he was a Stoic.
I said it wrong. Okay.
No, but the thing is, I think it's really exciting. And he was a Stoic. So it's interesting. While I was working on this also, for some weird reason, I found myself drawn to YouTube videos about Stoicism. There's definitely convergence there. I think it's interesting to look at people like Epictetus as perhaps an example of a secular person, right? A secular human being who recognized social sin and who attempted to rectify it with the things that you talked about. I also really enjoyed how you segued from Joseph Campbell, right? Like I really liked starting with Joseph Campbell and David Cooper. I love the way you started with kind of anthropology, linguistics, and you segued, because one of the things that Reverend Scott completely talked about is, theology is a composite, as a composite science or social science. And so I guess the question I'm going to ask you is, it's just so rich, and those were the things that I really focused on, the Joseph Campbell, David Cooper, of course, the polarization, balance, duality thing, like that's thematically, we're seeing that across the board. So in terms of proof texts, you seem to have like really rich sources. So what I'd like to do is I'd like to follow up with you to get the proof texts that you're using for each of these, or at least to just bullet what they are. Do you have the full proof text with the citation in your paper, or should we pull it and then we collaborate on that part?
Let's collaborate.
Sure. Thank you.
Because I can't do anything on the screen right now except read. You're up in a little corner and that's it.
Oh, yeah. All right,
Yeah, well, it was amazing, Mary. Thank you.
So thanks, Mary. No, so you made a claim about Epictetus being 24 BCE, but Epictetus was born in 50. So he was born not long after Jesus died. So are you sure that's the right name?
Is that the one I was talking about? Let me try to go back.
When you talked about the law code, the first time that the word freedom was mentioned,
Oh, that might be it. Yes. Yes,
Yeah.
that's what you was talking about.
that was not Epictetus. I don't think that was
No,
somebody.
no.
in the ancient period.
I used Epictetus only for his quote.
Yeah.
Your
Which
soul
quote? Which
carrying.
one?
Well, hold on. Let's. So who's the other source? Who's the other source? So we.
Oh,
We'll have a text. We can get all those answers later.
Yeah.
it's the code of
Because I've never heard that name before, and
neither did I. I was looking up Hammurabi, and that's how I got this.
Yeah, I thought it was Hammurabi, but it's not, right?
All right, so
No,
look for that code and raise your hand when you got it, so we can walk
Yeah.
away at least knowing that name.
And then we can follow up.
Yeah, we'll
and
follow up on
collaborate.
everything else because it's.
I think
all
it's
good.
Urukagina.
That's
Urukagina.
it.
Yes.
G-I-N-A.
G-I-N-A. Urukagina?
Yeah,
Never heard that name
Me
before.
neither. That's so awesome. And that is 24th century BC.
that's the one, 24th century BCE. Yeah.
All right.
Kaboom.
All
I'm
right,
sorry.
Let's take a deep breath. Let's say thank you, Dr. Mary Jones. All right, who wants to go next? All right, Giancarlo.
Okay, this is a bit of a draft.
Good.
I will,
I like to hear what people think is in the middle of it.
I know I'm interrupting Giancarlo. Is there a way that you can get a little closer to a microphone?
You just gotta speak up.
Yeah,
The microphone's right in front of him, so.
I'm working on my volume as it's anyway. So in order to have definitions for sin and salvation, I'm still working on trying to understand why the old ones don't work. So I go into that a bit.
Sure.
So Christianity was enforced by threat of law for much of modern history, especially through the Inquisition and colonialism. The church was an arm of an imperialist regimes to ensure obedience and authority. The Spanish Inquisition in Mexico City, burning native temples and rebranding of Tonatz was a prominent example. So it's modern Christianity is founded on the central belief that his authority is truly right and just. God has ultimate power, therefore he's ultimately right and just. And that makes things nice and easy. And if I was in, you know what, part of me could just stop right there. I could just, there's part of me that kind of envies that about my other theist friends who just do what God says. That's all you have
They
to.
wrapped it up and tied a bow on it. Here it is.
Right, it's not yours to think about. It's not yours to have to worry about. So an authoritative God cannot govern a community of equals. His legitimacy stems not from the number of converts, but from the number of tiers in the social ladder. You need a pope, a king, bishops, cardinals, lords, a noble class, a peasant class, Gentiles, quote unquote, a converted, a colonized class, and you need a slave class. That's the only way God is legitimate, as an authoritative figure, because you'll follow God despite his condemnation of you, because there's always someone lower than you on the ladder. So under these circumstances, sin is defined as transgression of authority, salvation, and to this day, a prime tenet of much of Christianity is obedience. And so under these circumstances, sin is defined as transgression of authority, salvation is defined as obedience to authority. God is powerful, therefore he is good. We, the colonists, are powerful, therefore we are good, therefore you will follow us. Rauschenbusch criticizes the church for putting too much stock in Genesis. The fall of man shoulders nearly the entire burden of justifying original sin. It became the default answer to how someone could be born, possibly be born into an unpayable moral debt. For most of history, this worked because of how it was, how the authority structure and will, kill you and burn your village if you, that whole thing. So that worked until it didn't, because at the turn of the 19th century, as the Gilded Age pushed technology, literacy, and democracy to unseen heights, the fall of man was strained by the constant probing of an oppressed and dejected working class, until it was a withered one-liner, one step behind because God says so. And that's why the old definition is really difficult to make work anymore. At least that's what I think Rauschenbusch is saying.
That's right.
So when he says sin becomes guilt in the full sense, in the degree to which intelligence will enter, I actually don't have any, we're at the bullet point section, so.
Sure.
So sin, I hear it mentions a lot as it implies a good self and a bad self, an angel on your shoulder, the devil on your shoulder, God and the devil talking to you, which, okay,
God and the devil.
just
God
talking to you, yeah, yeah. So that, I don't like, I don't like it, but because there's no, I don't see, and this, I don't know if I should even say this, but there's no evidence for it. There's no foundation. It's not solid anymore because the authority isn't behind it anymore. Or
There's
at least
also no
not-
responsibility.
Yeah, because you could just be, oh, that was just my bad. That was the devil. That was, sorry about that. That was the devil talking to me.
Devil made me do it.
Devil made me do it. But what I think they would have gotten around to, and what I think as the church, to its credit, did fund science and did fund research and mental health to a degree. And in the 1910s, around Rauschenbusch's time, that's when Freud started coming up with his whole thing, the id, the ego, and the superego. And I think that's what the church would have gotten around to with regard to the angel and the devil on the shoulder. Except it takes the moral, it takes the good and bad out of it, which I appreciate more. The id being the primal instincts with the lizard brains, it's called, about pleasure and self-preservation. The ego being the primate brain, the reality principle, getting what I want in an appropriate, socially acceptable manner, and the superego, which is your conscience, which I think would be described in religious circles as your higher self, higher power.
Or at least for the higher power speaking to you.
Yes, yes.
Yep.
So that I think is how sin can be incorporated into something that I could actually get behind, because the id is not bad. The ego is not bad. They're not bad things. They're not bad parts of you. They are our ancestors. They kept, they kept us alive. They were before we were, people. So it was all about survival, and they all have their functions. It's about regulating them. It's about growing within them. And that's why, going back to the fall of man, we identifying with Adam instead of blaming him, because I just have written here, Adam equals id, Eve equals ego, superego equals God. That's all I've got for that, really. But
Wow.
And
Quite Freudian. I did not expect that of you.
I didn't expect that.
Yay, that's good. Writing should be a discovery process. It's good stuff. I didn't mean to interrupt you. It's fascinating. I really like it.
I like the psychological point.
Thank you. I wrote some a little while ago about how I failed a morality test, and
In which context?
it was the 6 stages of moral development. I forget the name of the guy. I have it somewhere in here. And I got a 2 out of 6, solid 2 out of 6. I'm morally 8 years old.
Well, if you were a baseball player, that'd be good, right? 333, right? That's pretty good average.
Your moral demeanor seems pretty solid to me. But you're clearly not like, virtue signaling or anything. You're just pretty solid. But it's because you're you grew up UU, so of course your morality is skewed.
Yeah. Okay. So that's all I pretty much, except, wait, what do I have? Oh, the definitions. Sin equals breach of covenant. And what was the other one?
Salvation.
Salvation. It's a rough night.
No, I haven't had this much fun ever.
This is fun.
And salvation is, I've got some thread that can connect it to the Buddhist notion of loving kindness, where you don't need an authority figure or anyone, because love, even love is, I love you, I love that, I love this, I love it. It's dependent on the object. Loving kindness, transitive, right? Yeah. So that's all I've got in terms of, yeah.
And I would offer you to consider, since you define sin so succinctly as breach of covenant, maybe salvation is restoration of covenant. It can be more than that.
Can you say that again? Like, slowly?
Right. Yeah. So since you define sin as breach of covenant, I think part of your definition of salvation I would urge you to consider including restoration of covenant. You know, affirmation that covenant matters and restoration of any covenant that's been disrupted. Yeah. So I deliberately wanted sin and salvation maybe to be in conversation, you know, perhaps, right? You know, at some level, not all the way through, but there, since you were so succinct, yeah, that's really good stuff. All right, take a deep breath so we can try and let it, what Giancarlo just shared, go a little deeper. And I'll give thanks and praise to Giancarlo. Wow, that was fascinating. All right. You tell me what other you. That's what I want to know. Good God, y'all. All right. Let's see. So I know Nicole and Debbie and Sylvia have something. If someone else has something to read, just send me a private note in the chat. But for now, I think I'm going to call on Debbie.
All right.
Do I have yours? I don't have yours, do I?
You have mine.
I do?
Actually just shared it with you in Google Drive. And
Oh,
this is
okay.
Mine, so double, I know this mine too, so.
No, I'll if you just said in Google Drive, I'm going to oh, here it is. I just wanted to share it on the screen for those who, you know, like to follow along with the.
Yeah,
word.
that would be awesome.
That's all.
actually.
So while you're reading, it's on the screen. All right. So here we go. Remember anthropology. Okay.
All right. Before I start, I want to say I write two ways. One, if something comes to me, I write it down. And the other one is I work really good deadline. Most of this was actually done because it just came to my head and came out
Oh, cool.
on Saturday.
Awesome. Okay.
And then I just been tweaking with the rest of it. All right. My preamble. I was raised Roman Catholic. Within my beliefs of Druidry and Unitarian Universalism, though, I do not believe in sin or salvation. To explain these terms is a stretch for me, but I will do my best to define them. Growing up Catholic, we were taught sin was anything wrong we did, and we had to pray for our forgiveness, go to confession. That as long as we confessed to a priest, we were good. The repetition of Hail Marys and Our Fathers did not make any sense to me. I never did understand how only priests and higher clergy had a direct connection to God. I also never could understand original sin. How an innocent baby could be born with sin was a concept I could not grasp.
Amen. Me either.
Sin. Our theological glossary defines sin as doing what we know is wrong. However, what exactly determines if it is wrong? And wrong according to whom? Although I follow another pagan path other than Wicca, I do lead towards the Wiccan Ray Day. On the harm none, do what you will. Similar to the golden rule, do unto others as you would have done unto them, unto you. Which is mentioned in Luke 6:31. This means as long as it is not harming others, including animals or oneself, it is fine. A restatement with the least harm possible is something my elder and fellow classmate, the Rev Scott, has reminded me, which includes self-defense or defending others who are in harm's way.
What are you doing?
No, especially in Delaware.
Tell her, Boxy. Go ahead, Debbie.
This broader again, cites Ray Day can be applied to just about anything we do, including on a larger focus such as society and Mother Earth.
Okay.
Additionally, I believe in karma. When a person does wrong to another without any consideration for the other, they did to you. Wait. Additionally, I believe in karma. When a person does wrong to another without any consideration for the other, they did it too. Then they do come back to them. Okay, maybe it is not always instant karma, but it comes back to them and often back in threefold, rule of three.
So
Which is 3 times what the person or persons do come back to them.
yes. Thanks for the John Lennon reference, by the way, with this Carla.
I feel like it's getting better. Salvation, referring to this word as you pagans, probably not the correct term to use. As a former Catholic, I was taught that as long as we asked God for forgiveness, we were saved from hell. Since I do not believe in a place called hell, as universalists don't, I also do not see a need to be saved in that sense. Therefore, to define this word, in my understanding and belief, would be in the words of the late Beatle, John Lennon, whatever gets you through the night.
With David Sanborn on sax. Oh, go ahead.
Love it.
Go ahead.
Here's an example. The peak of our pandemic has shut in for almost a full year. That time with just family would have been terrible for me. However, the congregation and my friends got me through it. While everything around me shut down, there was always something to do at UUCM, mostly on Zoom, whether it was Soulful Sundown, Connection Cafe, Drop-in Covenant Group, Poetry Group, Heart and Soul, My Own Sacred Wheel. Beloved Conversations, or later in the pandemic, assisting Rev Scott to prepare a sanctuary for live streaming. Writing Tech, or co-teaching Magic 101, which with Foxy. There was something keeping me busy and learning. This took my focus off the liminal portal of nothingness at home and pulled me down that way.
Liminal portal of nothingness. That's awesome. Oh my goodness, Debbie Ann. I love it.
In fact, I was just thinking my basement for what seemed to be 8 days a week. It could be darker, it could be for anyone.
How many Beatles were there?
Is that a Beatles thing too?
Yeah,
Yeah,
8 days a week. What could have been a dreaded year and a half and some was not all that bad. I learned a lot in that time. And I lost my spot, right?
I learned a lot in that time. It's your last sentence. Very last sentence.
Here's mine.
Last sentence.
Yeah,
Here's right here.
there it is. I learned a lot in that time. I grew intellectually and spiritually and overcame some obstacles. So yeah, in that sense, that is my version of salvation.
Hey, yeah. Well, he is more popular than Jesus, or at least he used to be.
Here becomes such a great
Yeah, I think
speaker.
so.
Oh, wow. That was really good
Yeah.
stuff.
Yeah, I'm impressed.
Let me see if anyone else has told me in the chat that they have something to read. Let's see.
How about that?
They don't. Okay, so no, I'm not gonna call people. Some people have told me they don't have anything tonight. So I think we only have two more to hear from tonight. That we will be waiting with bated breath. I was trying to find a Beatles song to add to that, but I couldn't. For those who weren't able to share tonight, and maybe your role is instead to comment on our common work together. So there you go. So I've got Nicole and I've got Sylvia. So I'm going to actually ask Nicole to go next, if that's okay. And I have yours, or a version of yours, that I can also put on the screen. Okay.
Yes, it's the same one. I haven't changed it.
Okay.
Okay, so, and I'm not going to read like the entire thing word for word, right? Because it's a long, I think. Okay,
Hold on for a second. Let me pull it up.
sure.
And here we go. And Nicole Gray. Oh, first, did anybody have any questions for Debbie? I forgot to ask that. Sorry about that.
So in terms of like, I'm gonna definitely need your quotes, but I love your proof text.
I already shared it.
Yeah, and I love the fact that you talk about now, like, it's very like present and very Eckhart Tollean and very, I like that kind of writing, like a journalist.
So I appreciate that. Imagine that, because she is a journalist, for people who
Yes,
don't know.
she's a journalist.
And so the other interesting thing to me, is, you did share at the beginning that, yeah, that's why I don't go to Catholic church anymore, because I don't believe in this stuff. But you did still define it for yourself, because one of the tools that we need to acquire, I think, as Unitarian Universalists, to have a richer life of being able to talk about faith with people who aren't in our congregation, is being able to claim what we do believe and not just what we don't. So that's one of the main points of this whole exercise. So thank you for that. All right, here we go.
Okay, so I start with the statement, the starting point, each human being has inherent dignity and worth. It's our first principle of Unitarian Universalism. Human beings have evolved biologically and socially for hundreds of thousands of years with a built-in capacity for collaboration, community building, and innovation, as well as a built-in capacity for war, greed, and destruction. That duality is seen throughout the human condition and is an organizing principle in many of the world's largest religions. There's a natural tension between what is good and bad, duality. Sin is defined in the world's major religions as an absolute all or nothing proposition. In fact, humans contend with choices and situations that are nuanced, challenging, and almost never completely dualistic. According to Minister Ron Graham, author of simplybible.com, sin is a serious matter. Let's take it very seriously indeed, but let us never confuse real sin with the imagined sins manufactured out of normal human nature. There is personal sin and social sin. Social sin manifests in wealth consolidation that drives inequity, violence, many different types of discrimination, and environmental devastation. These types of social sins are profound and reverberate across space and time. One of the core definitions of sin is that it drives more sin. Therefore, social justice activity targets undoing the genesis of the sinful situation. There are efforts to recognize, name, and respond to social sins that we find redemption as we continue to move towards personal and social, not societal, social salvation. So I'm going to quickly, I'm not going to read all of these, but these are the proof texts, right? And so I went through and looked first at ours. And so I went back to the first principle, but I included in the first principle this idea of, life force, right? This inchoate idea, and that includes people, animals, plants, and environmental ecosystems. So it comes back to kind of broadening the first principle of Unitarian Universalism. Next, I looked at the 6 different sources of UU, and I chose 5. I did not choose the 6th one. It didn't seem relevant to how I was setting this up. But again, experience, of the world around us, an empirical approach from the traditions, Christian, Jewish traditions, and other traditions, earth tradition, wisdom from world's religion, and of course, secular humanism. So then I move on to kind of what underscores that initial overview. And what is sin? Well, sin can be an act of commission or omission. It's personal and it's social, and it has consequences. The following categories of sin are not absolute. Rather, these categories of sin are considered building blocks for a sinful existence. And these are the personal sins, 4 kinds of sins from the Catholic tradition. And I'm not Catholic, but I just am fascinated. I think it's a beautiful religion, and I just love the all of the scholarship and the way it's laid out. So a lot of my stuff came from the Catholic tradition. So these are sins of attitude, false pride, unjust anger, bitter envy, malicious hatred, sins of action, drunkenness, adultery, stealing, blasphemy, sins of neglect, not doing the things that God has commanded us to do. Note that sins of intent, which is one of these sins, I didn't include that because that's, this idea that you sin in your head, the things, your thoughts, but we are not our thoughts. But then even more importantly, social sins, sins of neglect in which we lack the lack of specific actions that can be taken are not taken. The sum total of allowing circumstances to advance without intervention is increased suffering. Sins of commission, actively excluding others from options for well-being in order to amass all opportunities and resources for oneself or one's group of interest. And then intentional or benignly unaddressed racism, sexism, homophobia, classism, ableism, transphobia, and other mortal sins of oppression. And then those are the proof texts from Micah, Matthew, and Psalms. And basically they are aimed at, looking after the well-being of others as we would look after the well-being of ourselves and our families and communities. And then I move on to, again, this is coming, I think, also from the Catholic tradition, the role of the 7 deadly sins, and then the antidote behaviors, and they're laid out there, which we all pretty much know them: pride, greed, lust, envy, gluttony, wrath, and sloth. And then to balance those, right, you can balance those out with humility, charity, chastity, gratitude, temperance, patience, and diligence. But so the point that I'm making here is these are the 7 deadly sins, but if you really want to, you can very easily extrapolate this kind of individualistic approach to making it social. So, you know, on a social level, like, so for example, greed stands out as a major, prevalent, ever present social sin, right? A sin that compounds and,
Oh, yeah.
thank you. A sin that compounds and grows, slowed only by activity aimed at increasing social justice. Likewise, gluttony occurs in numerous social contexts, but once again, relates back to the idea of social sin, taking more than deserved or needed at the expense of others. And then what's salvation? It means being saved, but what are you being saved from? From the consequences of sin? No. Salvation means the opportunity to try again, to seek redemption and to make amends. There's a chance to gain spiritual insight and guidance so as to understand the parameters of what is essentially good and what does not contribute to personal or societal good. Salvation requires an understanding of sin beyond the realm of the personal. And salvation is just as important, if not more so, for the broader community and world as it is for an individual. Individual salvation is meaningless without a community with whom you're connected and interdependent. And then the proof text comes from Proverbs. And then salvation through Tikkun Olam, world repair, requires social action, which is aimed at creating social justice and repairing the world. As human beings, we are required to participate in the contemplative performance of fixing the world and undoing social injustice. And the proof text comes from Yehuda Halevi, which you can see there. But this one I really like. The human being is unique among animals in its rational faculty. Thus, humans can do tikkun of their character traits, then tikkun of their household, and then tikkun of the state. And then I'm going to add more of the whole world. And I think that's it.
A deep breath to let it sink in even a little farther. Give it the space it deserves. And then a thank you to Nicole. All right. So any observations or questions, or maybe I should actually move us to
Yeah.
Sylvia's first. Does anyone have any
Sylvia.
questions though? Because I can't.
Yes. What is
Please,
tikkun?
yes.
How do you define tikkun?
Alam tikkun. So basically, I refine it as repair.
Repair
Right.
of the world, yeah.
Yeah, and so tikkun though can operate in different ways. So a lot of times just tzedakah is considered alam tikkun, right? And then often though it's something bigger in terms of repairing the world, in terms of, you know, the recognizing injustice is a form of alam tikkun, because it's the first step that you have to take in order to act on that. But for me, the most important part, I mean, we understand the translation of it, right? It is action. It's not sitting on your ass, right? Talking about social justice. That's what it's not. And that's that my whole thing is that. So whatever proof text draws on social action and the need to actually go out with your thing and do the work, I'll take any proof text that does that without pressing anyone, of course.
I am in the midst of theological greatness, and we have one more left to go. Sylvia, I'm going to invite you to read this if you're so moved, unless you would prefer someone else to read it for you.
Yeah, Sylvia.
Are you there, Sylvia?
She's muted.
Yeah, you're muted, Sylvia. Oh, there
Okay,
you go.
sorry about that.
Perfect. Here we go.
Okay, let me see here.
And it's on the screen, if that helps.
So I realize we're short on time. We'll see how far we get.
We got time
We're
for all of
listening
you.
to you.
We're good. We're good. This is the last thing we're doing in class
I'm
today.
taking notes, Sylvia.
And she's taking.
Okay. All right, so I really started with a focus on context, on situational, the situational present as a way of exploring these concepts, and it is an exploration, not definitive. In present day parlance, these concepts of sin and salvation have faded from everyday concern for many, as religion has taken a backseat in popular US culture, perhaps with the exception of some evangelistic groups, and the search for meaning often goes missing. We find ourselves in a time of challenge, loss, disconnection, and extreme polarization. We as a society cannot agree on what is truth. The rise of the concept of alternative facts has polluted the atmosphere and clouded a clear version of the horizon. Our democracy is at risk as those who wish to hold the power put being right above seeking a moral, equanimous way. Guided by greed, they seek to prohibit access to power for those whose rights are being actively abolished by power plays. Hierarchies of power have arisen and infiltrated with systemic dominance, propagating oppression over others on the basis of purported aspects of inferiority, acts stimulated through shame, guilt, and fear. In a false sense of the order of things, we humans have grasped an upside-down concept, worshipped a god of consumption, and elevated an idea that humans are superior, entitled to dominate all life forms. We have lost our way. It is also a time pregnant with possibility. George Floyd's death, the Black Lives Matter and Me Too movements, youth marching for gun control laws, all these have provoked questioning of the status quo and shone a bright light on grim realities of life experienced by a huge segment of the population, especially people of color, the poor, and women. While the dangers of potential devastation of climate change loom over the globe, it is also a time of potential awakening, of rediscovering our connection to Pachamama, our Earth Mother. The past will not let us go until we have a reckoning with it. It is a myth-breaking moment when we might reconnect with the spirit of Mother Nature, a need for connection to the ancient embodied soul, to the cosmic web of interconnection. It is a moment of potential reconnection to intuitive intelligence, a moment which calls for humanity and reverence for the sacred in all life forms. It is a moment that calls for recognition, action, fearless engagement, radical reorientation. And much of what I've said so far was inspired by a Buddhist seminar and discussion that occurred over the weekend. It is in this context that we revisit the concept of sin. With actions and inaction, we ignore and escape the truths right before us. We hide our heads in the sand and harden our hearts. Actions have dire consequences on our planet. Inactions perpetuate suffering on a large portion of the population. It's time to wake up, decolonize our minds, and engage in practice our brotherhood, sisterhood with all beings. Salvation is needed from the dominant ways the patriarchy has skewed our knowing and fed our habitual unconsciousness. We cry for connections, for knowing what is true, for working toward and realizing a beloved community, for the truth of our interconnection with all life forms. In the process of rediscovering our true selves, we also seek to be inclusive. We need to take care that we don't side with ourselves only or always, but approach others who have a different point of view with curiosity to discover and learn. Fragmentation is not only in the outside world, it's also in our own hearts. In our eagerness to promote peace beyond conflict, we must see a larger, more inclusive perspective. We can take refuge in wholeness, and work toward doing the least harm. So that's sort of my exploration. And I'm not going to read this, but along the way, I found this poem by Joe Harjo, who is the first Native American poet laureate in the US. And so I offer that.
We'll use that as a closing reading, okay? But first, I want to stop and give us a chance to breathe in what you just shared, and then give thanks. And it's my understanding that we don't have anybody else who's writing more to share tonight. Am I correct in that thinking? If so, just if I'm not, send me a chat message or just unmute and start talking. So I am really floored, overjoyed, so humbled by your sharing and your writing. I'm just really, I mean, you know, you probably realize this at this point, but I had no idea this was actually what I was going to ask you to do for the end of this class. It just hit me because of how seriously you all were taking this book. And I had an experience with an interfaith colleague who basically dismissed my entire religion. He wasn't really trying to, but he's like, well, you guys don't care about this stuff anyway, because he started talking to me about some theology, you know, and he looked at me, he's like, and you know, and so I entertained him in a dialogue that I think he was surprised I was prepared to have. And so this made me realize that, you know, we're not actually asking people to do this kind of work. So how can they possibly be getting trained in doing it or have any chance to share it? So, you know, yeah, so I'm probably going to share some of the product of this class with our seminary. We had Neva Lombard Theological School here a couple weeks ago. The president, whom I'm very close to, Dr. Ortega, he actually stayed at our home. And he's sort of intrigued by what we're doing. But I could tell he really didn't know. And I don't expect him to watch 6 hour-and-a-half videos. So I'm just going to send him whatever text that we have. I know he's a voracious reader, so he'll probably be quite amazed at what we've come up with so far. Any of the rest of you that have something else to offer, and if you know anyone else in the class, I'll send out a message asking anyone who may have written something but couldn't make it tonight to send it to me.
Yeah.
There's a few other people in the class.
Whoever wants to,
Yeah.
right? And we'll make sure
And
that everything that
And
comes
we're
in.
not trying to do anything with this until like March or April. So
Yeah, it's
we're
gonna be a process, a project.
Yeah, and we hopefully, I will be working with Nicole and Sharon to make sure it doesn't get too large to manage. Because I'd like to have some product, you know, in March or April,
Yeah,
even
of
if it's just a
course.
self-published pamphlet of things, you know.
Oh,
And a
don't
working
worry, we
Reverend
group.
can-
Scott,
Yeah, and a website
Yeah.
and a video. I'm gonna
Reverend
make-
Scott, I'd like to get hold of Debbie if I could, so she can help me with the technology of sending this to you. She
Sure.
lives in Nutley. Would she be able to come over and help?
Yeah,
Sure. Why don't,
Debbie Ann is the hero.
I got you on my phone.
oh, you got her on the phone?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, okay, perfect. Yeah, you can find her in Realm too.
Yeah.
Wait, Are you coming on Sunday,
Have you-
Dr. Jones, Mary?
Mary, have you been coming on Sundays? I don't think I've seen you yet on Sundays,
No,
right?
no, not yet. I'm
Oh,
done.
this Sunday is the bread. You want some bread?
Okay. No,
Okay, sir.
I'm not
So
venturing
all
out.
of it- all of this started because another encounter where I was talking to someone who they're very religious. They would tell you how religious they were. They might mention Jesus 32 times in a 2-minute conversation. Bless their hearts. And
Bless
I
their
tried to
pea-picking
talk to him.
heart.
What's that? What was that?
I said, bless their pea picking little heart.
Satan's twin brother.
Yep.
And then I'm like, you know, I've always read the Bible as being about the social gospel. So then I looked for this text and found it. And, you know, as I do, I got really excited about it and decided this was what I was going to teach this autumn. And so, you know, I think this is the work our faith going forward. How do we equip more people who are Unitarian Universalists to really be part of this conversation in a way that has some richness and depth and can be shared amongst people from other faith traditions? So, it's clear that we are deeply theological and we do consider what our roots are. We don't just say these things that we should do so as if we're like a public policy institute, because that's what we sound like to a lot of other religious groups.
But we encounter other religious groups at protests and things like that,
Yes.
right? And so that's where it's really clear that there's a constellation between all of our theology. And
There is, but they often just think of us as theologically shallow. They would never say that,
Right.
most of them.
Mhm.
But they honestly do think that we're just a leading cultural
Mhm.
critical movement that's focused on public policy.
Like
And-
secular humanism,
And
basically.
so, and interestingly, secular humanism, actually isn't a sort of community. I mean, the interesting thing about secular humanism, is it's being secular. They don't think they need to have institutions, right?
Right, well, they
Or
have
there
a
is a
school, right, on the Upper East Side.
There's a religious humanism,
Yeah, okay,
but
Yeah.
the secular humanists, yeah, they do like to study, but it's not the same. It's not. And so they often mistake us for that. They
I
mistake
see.
us for ethical culture. They don't understand our deep roots from out of the Protestant Reformation. They don't understand that we are really trying to be a world religious movement where we're trying to equip people to build and express and proclaim their own theology. So this, I think, is the next step in that, if we can find a way to bottle this. And I just really want to thank you all for your amazing gifts and attention to this. So I'm going to go.
thank you, Reverend Scott.
Well,
You're
it's
amazing.
I-
Yay,
I'm
right, let's
amazing.
clap for Reverend Scott,
Yes.
everybody.
because
As Carl said, Rev Scott was cool.
Best adult RE
There's a-
on the East Coast.
Charles didn't.
That's right, Charles. That's right. Charles Hilton says not only did he say I'm cool, he made a little label that he stuck onto the lectern that says that.
Oh,
Very
that's
funny.
so sweet.
This is sweet of a young man. All right. So we're going to go ahead and read this. There's nothing better I can think of to close us out than a Joy Harjo poem. She actually has a couple of pieces in one of our worship manuals. The one that you probably haven't seen much. It's like a red color one. Lifting our voices, or yeah. So Eagle Poem by Joy Harjo. To pray, you open your whole self to sky, to earth, to sun, to moon, to one whole voice that is you. And know there is more that you cannot see, cannot hear, cannot know, except in moments steadily growing and in languages that aren't always sound, but other circles of motion. Like eagle that Sunday morning over Salt River, circled in blue sky and wind, swept our hearts clean with sacred wings. We see you, see ourselves, and know that we must take the utmost care and kindness in all things. Breathe in, knowing we are made of all this, and breathe, knowing we are truly blessed because we were born and die soon within a true circle of motion, like eagle rounding out the morning inside us. We pray that it will be done in beauty. In beauty. Thank you,
That's
Sylvia.
gorgeous.
Yeah.
That is beautiful.
So,
Great choice, Sylvia.
all right. Well, all you theologians, those who have submitted some writing and those who haven't, just understand, what a great gift you've given me, affirming my notion that this was something that was worthwhile to do here.
I'm super excited to see Deb's and Shirley's.
That's coming along, and I'm going to go ahead and end us. And we went a little over tonight, and I just don't care, because when it's like I say on Sunday morning worship, right? If it's good, it doesn't matter how long it is, So every now and then.
Spoken like a true Baptist.
But it's got to be good. Like I know. But last week, it was going to be good, and we had a lot of congregational stuff in that service. Thanking Al and thanking this group and doing that, and a new member ceremony. And I knew that, you know, that the sermon that I composed with Kira reading the words of Holy Murray, I knew it was going to be good. So I didn't even care. I didn't even look at the clock, you know. Anyway, love you all.
Thank
Looking
you.
forward to the next time together, and stay in touch. Send me, who hasn't, send me your writings, and so we can collect them and start seeing out what we're doing with them. And
Good night.
Good
Bye.
night.
Good night,
Bye-bye.
everybody.
Good night.
Bye.
I'll talk to you, Debbie.
Sure.
Bye-bye.
bye, Shirley. Thank you. Bye, everybody.
Good night.
Guys.
Good night.